A black lawyer steps into court to defend her client, only to find herself on trial instead. What happens next will leave you stunned. The courtroom was packed, not a single empty seat in sight. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came with cases where truth alone wasn't enough. Attorney Simone Caldwell knew that feeling all too well. For over a decade, she had fought for clients in cases where justice wasn't a guarantee, especially when race was a factor. She smoothed her blazer, took a steady breath, and glanced at her client, DeAndre Porter, a 22-year-old black man accused of stealing from the convenience store where he worked. The charge was baseless, a case that should have never made it this far. The so-called evidence. Paper-thin. A blurry security tape, conflicting witness statements, nothing concrete. But the prosecutor pressed on, banking on the jury seeing DeAndre as guilty before they ever saw him as human. Simone prepared to deliver her closing argument, the moment that could decide this young man's fate. She straightened her papers, ready to speak, when suddenly, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with force. A uniformed officer strode in, his presence slicing through the tension like a blade. Behind him, another man followed, his expression unreadable. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, confusion rippling through the crowd. Simone's brow furrowed, but she kept her posture firm. She had seen enough courtroom theatrics to recognize when someone was trying to send a message. The officer didn't stop until he reached the judge's bench. His voice was crisp, unwavering. "Your Honor, we need to detain Attorney Caldwell for questioning." Silence fell. Judge Ronald Beasley, a man known for his strict adherence to the law, looked up, his expression unreadable. Simone blinked. "I beg your pardon." Her heartbeat remained steady. Years of experience had trained her to stay calm in moments like this. She leveled her voice. "What is this about?" The officer, badge number 4071, didn't respond to her directly. Instead, his eyes flicked to the defense table, lingering on her briefcase before shifting to the Mercedes key fob beside it. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching the description of the one you arrived in today," he stated, hands resting on his belt. Simone raised an eyebrow. "My car." A ripple of hushed whispers spread through the courtroom. The jury, the gallery, even DeAndre, everyone was watching. Judge Beasley cleared his throat. "Officer, I trust you have a compelling reason for disrupting my courtroom mid-trial." The officer remained firm. "I have a report matching both the vehicle and the suspect's description." Simone inhaled slowly through her nose. She had fought battles in court where justice was a distant hope, where the burden of proof never seemed to favor those who looked like her. But this wasn't just another case. Today, she wasn't just a defense attorney. She was a black woman being accused before she'd even had a chance to speak. And the way the officer looked at her, as though she were already guilty, made it clear that proof alone wouldn't be enough. Silence hung in the room, stretching thick and suffocating. All eyes were locked on Simone. The judge's mouth pressed into a hard line. The officer didn't waver, his squared shoulders bracing as if expecting resistance. Simone tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She reached for the key fob, holding it up between two fingers. "This car." Her voice was measured. "The black Mercedes parked outside? The one I've owned for 3 years." The officer didn't flinch. A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Someone muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Judge Beasley sat up straighter. "Counselor Caldwell is an officer of this court. It is highly irregular, if not outright inappropriate, to question an attorney about their own vehicle in the middle of a trial." The officer finally turned toward the bench. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we have reason to believe the car was stolen. We received a report that a vehicle matching this description was taken from a residence in the area." Simone arched an eyebrow. "That's interesting, because that residence belongs to me." The officer didn't answer. She inhaled deeply, keeping her temper in check. "So let's be clear. You're telling me that someone reported my car, one that I legally own and drove here today, as stolen? I'd love to see that report." She motioned toward the briefcase. "I have my registration, insurance, and driver's license right here. If you need proof, I can provide it, without disrupting this trial." The officer barely glanced at her documents. Instead, he took a step closer, his stance rigid. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come down to the station to verify that information." A stunned silence fell over the room. Simone's stomach clenched, not with fear, but with a deep, familiar frustration. She had represented too many clients forced to prove their innocence before the system even considered their rights. And now, here she was. She straightened. Her voice, when she spoke, was iron. "Officer, you're asking me, an attorney actively defending a client in court, to abandon my trial because someone made an unverified claim about my car?" "Yes, ma'am." Simone let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "And you're not even interested in checking my paperwork first?" The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A few jury members exchanged glances. Some, particularly the black jurors, looked visibly angry. Simone turned to the judge. "Your Honor, if this officer insists on treating me like a suspect in front of my client, in your courtroom, I'd like to remind him that under constitutional law, I have the right to remain here unless he is placing me under arrest. Otherwise, this is a blatant abuse of authority." The judge hesitated, but before he could speak, another voice rang out. "She's right." A public defender had risen to his feet. "This is completely inappropriate," he continued. "You can't just walk into a courtroom and disrupt an active trial over a vague claim. You haven't even identified who filed the report." The officer shifted. "I don't have that information at this time." "That did it." The murmurs swelled into a full-blown uproar. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" Simone remained silent, her hands gripping the defense table. The tension was suffocating. The judge exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. But the officer wasn't backing down. And Simone knew, this wasn't just about a car anymore. The room seemed to shrink. The officer's stance remained rigid. Simone didn't move. Judge Beasley adjusted his glasses, his voice tight. "Officer, you mean to tell me that you came into my courtroom to remove an attorney from an active trial over a car? Do you have a warrant? An arrest order? Anything beyond hearsay?" The officer stiffened but held his ground. "No, Your Honor. But we have probable cause based on the report." Simone let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Probable cause? Are you serious?" The jury was watching, absorbing everything. Her client, DeAndre, shifted uncomfortably. He had spent the entire trial trying to convince them he wasn't a thief. And now, the lawyer defending him was being accused of stealing, too. Simone saw it in his eyes, that flicker of realization. They never saw us as innocent to begin with. She turned back to the officer, choosing her words carefully. "I'll say this once. You are not taking me anywhere. You have no warrant. No evidence. And if this is about my car, you can verify my ownership right now instead of turning this courtroom into a spectacle." The officer's jaw clenched. He knew she was right. But it wasn't about the car anymore. It was about control. And that's when a second officer stepped inside. Another uniform. Another show of force. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. The mood in the courtroom had shifted from disbelief to full-blown tension. Simone heard the scrape of a chair. One of the jurors, an older black man, had leaned forward, his brows deeply furrowed. "You've got to be joking," he muttered under his breath. But it wasn't a joke. The second officer moved toward her defense table, his posture clear. He was preparing to escort her out. Simone wasn't going anywhere. She turned to Judge Beasley. "Your Honor, you cannot allow this. If I leave this courtroom, I am abandoning my client in the middle of closing arguments. This isn't just an insult to me, it's an insult to the legal system you swore to uphold." The judge clenched his jaw. He knew it too. But the moment was bigger than him now. Reporters in the back of the courtroom had their cameras raised, ready to capture every second. The second she stepped outside, the headlines would explode. Black attorney pulled from court over false accusation. She could already see it. The first officer leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Ms. Caldwell, if you resist, This will become a bigger issue than it needs to be. Simone tilted her head. Are you arresting me? Silence. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. The moment they cuffed her, they'd have to justify it. And there was nothing to justify. She exhaled through her nose. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to verify my registration and ownership, right here, in front of everyone. If my name is on that car, you will apologize and walk out of this courtroom. Her voice was sharp, each word slicing through the tension like a blade. The second officer looked at badge 4071. A beat passed. Then he pressed his radio. Dispatch, I need a verification on a black Mercedes-Benz license plate. Simone reached into her briefcase, pulled out the registration, and slid it across the table. Here. Save yourself the trouble. The officer took it, walking toward the side of the room, radio still in hand. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Beasley sat back in his chair, fingers steepled. The jury exchanged glances. The audience whispered among themselves. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then the radio crackled to life. The vehicle is registered to Simone Caldwell. No reports of theft. No outstanding warrants. Silence. Simone's hands never shook. She folded her arms, watching as the officers exchanged looks. They had nothing. She knew it. They knew it. Judge Beasley's voice was low, controlled. Well, officers, what now? The second officer cleared his throat. Looks like there was a mix-up. A mix-up. Simone let out a slow exhale. That's what they always called it. The judge's gaze darkened. Then I expect you to remove yourselves from my courtroom immediately. The second officer nodded, turned, and walked out. Badge 4071 hesitated, his pride bruised. He looked at Simone, as if searching for a way to maintain his authority. But there was nothing left to say. So he left too. Just like that, it was over. Except Simone knew it wasn't really over at all. Because DeAndre was still sitting there, watching. And the lesson he had just learned was one he would never forget. Even as the officers disappeared, the tension didn't break. It lingered, thick, suffocating. Judge Beasley pulled off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. He looked at Simone, then at the jury, then back at her. Ms. Caldwell, he said, his voice quiet but steady, do you need a moment before continuing your closing? The gavel struck. Simone turned to DeAndre. He was still frozen, his hands covering his face. His shoulders rose and fell with each shaky breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him even as the verdict had set him free. You did it, she said quietly. He lowered his hands slowly, his eyes glassy with disbelief. I can go. She nodded. You can go. The words felt surreal. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, some voices hushed, others louder, filled with relief or quiet frustration. The prosecutor, Matthew Denton, exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. He knew he'd lost, but more than that, he knew why. Judge Beasley had already stood, retreating to his chambers without another word. The jury filed out, some glancing at Simone on their way. The white woman in her 50s, the one who had shifted uncomfortably during her closing, paused just long enough to meet Simone's gaze. There was something there, something uncertain. Not regret, but recognition. DeAndre finally stood, his movements stiff, like he wasn't sure he could trust his own body. He turned to Simone. Thank you. She gave him a small smile. Go see your mother. He let out a breath, nodded, and stepped away. As he walked toward the exit, people parted for him. A few reporters had already started to slip out, eager to be the first to push the headlines. Not guilty. A courtroom showdown between justice and perception. Defense attorney calls out bias in stunning closing argument. Was it ever about the evidence? Simone didn't care about the headlines. She collected her briefcase, her hands steady now. But as she turned to leave, she felt it. The weight. The officers were gone. The trial was over. But the lesson remained. No matter what she achieved, no matter how many cases she won, no matter how many times she proved herself, there would always be moments like today, where she wasn't attorney Simone Caldwell. Just another black woman forced to prove she belonged. She exhaled slowly, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the courtroom. Enough. He nodded, still processing everything. He turned to leave but then hesitated. Miss Caldwell. She looked at him. He swallowed. You think they really thought your car was stolen? That was the question, wasn't it? Simone didn't answer right away. She had her suspicions. Maybe it was a random mistake. Maybe it was a calculated move. Maybe someone in that courthouse, someone who didn't like how loud she was, wanted to remind her that no matter how many suits she wore, she could still be pulled from a courtroom like a criminal. She let out a slow breath. I think some people don't need proof to believe we don't belong. DeAndre nodded. He understood. He had always understood. Simone finally turned to the reporters, the cameras, the questions waiting to be answered. Because this wasn't just her story, it was bigger than that. She straightened her blazer, stepped forward, and spoke. Because silence was never an option. Simone watched as DeAndre hesitated, still trying to process everything. You're free, she told him gently. He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't even know what to feel right now. She gave him a small, tired smile. Start with feeling free. A half-laugh, half-sigh escaped him as he took it in. Around them, the courtroom buzzed, people whispering, gathering their things, moving on. But Simone's attention was drawn to the back of the room. Officer Badge 4071 stood there, watching her. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't afraid, but she knew this wasn't over. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked out. Had he been waiting to see if DeAndre would be convicted? Or had he just wanted to remind her that he was still there? It didn't matter. Justice had won today, at least for now. But one question remained. Who had reported her car stolen in the first place? As Simone and DeAndre stepped outside, the weight of everything that had happened lingered in the air. Relief, exhaustion, maybe even anger. The crowd outside was waiting. Reporters stood ready, cameras rolling, microphones extended. The story had already spread, but she wasn't ready to face them just yet. DeAndre let out a breath. So, I just go home now. She smiled. Yeah, you go home. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't even know how to thank you. She shook her head. Live your life. That's thanks enough. He nodded, still absorbing it all. But just as he turned to leave, he hesitated. Miss Caldwell. She met his gaze. He swallowed. Do you think they really thought your car was stolen? That was the real question. Simone didn't answer right away. She had her suspicions. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe it had been deliberate. Maybe someone inside that courthouse, someone who didn't like how outspoken she was, had wanted to send a message. A reminder that no matter how many degrees she had, how many suits she wore, or how many cases she won, she could still be pulled from a courtroom like a criminal. She exhaled slowly. Some people don't need proof to believe we don't belong. DeAndre nodded. He understood. He had always understood. Finally, Simone turned to the reporters, the flashing cameras, the sea of questions waiting to be asked. This wasn't just her story. It was bigger than that. She straightened her blazer, stepped forward, and spoke. Silence is never an option. If you believe in fairness, if you believe in holding power accountable, use your voice. Speak up. Call it out. Because if we let moments like this slide, they won't just continue, they'll become normal. She let the words settle, then finished with one last message. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that need to be told, because the conversation doesn't stop here.